Well, okay. So, welcome everybody. And this is the episode of Agree to Argue that everybody has been waiting for. Is God pro-slavery? And this is going to be something. This is certainly going to be something, right? Steve's already rubbing his face. I'm telling you, we have been working on this for a while on social media. There has been a lot of conversation, and there's literally nobody out there that doesn't have an opinion one way or another. So I just want to welcome everybody and remind everyone, please, we have one rule. Like, you bring the fun and bring the challenges, but play nice. That's it. Just play nice. Also, we have something new happening at ATA, and that is we are getting together a launch team. So that more people can get this content and hear about this, we would love to have your help and get the word out there. You will also get some super cool swag and some super secret swag. So, but we can't divulge all of that. If you're interested, just hit me up. You can send an email to ask@agreetoargue.com. So send an email, ask@agreetoargue.com. We can fill you in more as to what you would have to do and to help us out and what you would be getting from us. So from there, I guess I'm going to bounce it over to Steve and Fuz to fill us in. I'm sure you guys are already totally on the same page on this. I know that I already saw in the comments that starting out with John Park, it's like, is God pro-slavery? The answer is yes. So did you guys have anything to add to that? Or are we good?
Let's wrap it up. Yeah.
All right, we're good.
Yep.
Call it a wrap.
I guess John's got the answer there.
I win.
You win. All right, Steve wins this one. All of that prep, Fuz, all of that prep. By the way, also, we're going to welcome Josh Bowen, who is very well-versed in this topic. And we look forward to bringing him on in a few minutes. But let's get rolling with Steve and Fuz and unpack this for us a little bit as to where we're headed with this and where you guys respectively stand on the matter.
I got to tell you, this is a tough topic. This is one of those topics that neither side, I think, really likes to talk about a lot. One, because of the theist side, it's kind of a touchy subject. Let's be realistic. I mean, the mere thought of an omnipotent, omnibenevolent deity that even remotely seems to endorse slavery in the Bible, people don't want to talk about. And then on the non-believer side, it's difficult because, one, you've got to know a lot about the Bible. You got to understand the terminology being used in the Bible. You got to understand what is being discussed, the types of slavery. And I saw somebody mention in the live chat there, what kind of slavery we've been talking about. That's something we're, I think, going to get into, and I think it'd be most interesting. Is it a type of chattel slavery? Is it de jure? Is it a de facto type of slavery? And personally, I mean, from what I read in the Bible, and I am not a Bible literist by any stretch of imagination. I don't do exegesis hardly at all. But from what I just kind of read in the Bible, it seems to me that God does seem to at least give recommendations of how to treat slaves. And if that isn't at least a tacit, complicit way of looking at slavery, I don't know what is. Now, is he pro-slavery? I don't know if that's a totally different question. I mean, he's like, yes, you must have a slave. Or is it more, hey, if you're going to have slaves, I'm cool with it, and this is how you do it? That's my position.
Yeah. Well, I would take the view that actually Scripture, the Bible, condemns slavery, and I'm sympathetic to the point that many skeptics and even some Christians would point to certain passages, for example, in Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, that seem on the surface, I think, to condone slavery, or at least to provide some framework for some type of slavery. But actually, if you look at other places in Scripture, there's very clear statements of condemnation against slavery. And the first place I would point to would be the prophets. For example, in Amos, or also we see this in Isaiah, there's very clear, again, condemnation of the practice of human trafficking. For example, in Amos 1, Amos 2, Amos 8, Amos is condemning Tyre, Gaza, and Israel for engaging in human trafficking. In Isaiah 58:61, it's not as direct of a condemnation as you see in Amos, but again, Judah is being condemned for engaging in human trafficking. And the reason why this is, in my view, really significant is because the prophets in the Old Testament were not just simply foretelling the future, they were God's mouthpieces. They were speaking on behalf of Yahweh. And in this case, we have two prophets that are condemning Judah, Israel, and in neighboring countries for slave practices. And the standard that's being used is actually the Ten Commandments and the covenantal code found in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, which says to me that those passages that we oftentimes interpret as being an endorsement of slavery actually are referring to something very different. And I would contend that these passages are actually being put in place to protect the oppression of vulnerable peoples within Israel, which would be people that were poor or people that were non-Israelites that were in the country as temporary residents or as visitors. But another passage that, again, is significant towards this end is the letter that the Apostle Paul writes to Timothy. This is 1 Timothy 1-9, where he's going through, again, the last of the 10 commandments, to commandment 6-9, and he's listing out these commandments, and he's essentially pointing out that the law is actually there to expose our rebellion against God. And included in that is actually the practice of slave trading or human trafficking. And so this is significant because Paul is a Hebrew scholar, and he's citing the law, again, in order to point out that slavery is something that God condemns. So to me, I think when you look at these passages that are in reference to, again, the covenantal code, it's very clear that there's this, I think, a very strong condemnation of slavery, which suggests to me that, again, the passages that everybody points to as condoning slavery are really talking about something very different.
Well, I definitely hope Dr. Bowen's taking some really good notes at this moment, which I'm sure that he is. But here's my pushback on that, because I again, when we're talking about slavery, right? To me, somebody had asked, how do you want to define slavery? To me, slavery is a position where you have no ability to leave your master's control. I mean, you have no autonomy. You're treated as a piece of property that is owned by somebody, and you have no more autonomy for yourself. You've basically have lost humanization of yourself, and that's more than just an economic position. I understand there's economic slavery. There's the de facto slavery that says, okay, even though not under the law, there's no law that says about, having slavery or anything like that. But, you're in economic conditions that are tantamount to being very analogous to being a slave. But in the Bible, it seems to be that these are actual slaves. They're property owned by a slave master. And God is giving them commandments, direct commandments on how to treat your property. And you mentioned the 10 commandments. I think it's kind of odd when you have commandments like thou shalt have no other gods, that you should not make any idols, you should not take the Lord's name in vain, and not one of them could be, it says explicitly, thou shalt not own people. That's where I kind of have to go, wait a minute here. If God's going to tell people that, again, let's say that he is omnipotent, he's going to know how we're going to be interpreting this stuff 2,000 years later after the fact, or 4,000 years or whatever from the Old Testament. At no time does he ever explicitly, that I've seen, say, look, you shall never own slaves. Slavery is bad. Owning people as property is bad. I take that as an objective fact, right? I as you know, I subscribe to more realism for the most part. So I think there are objective facts that exist that are not contingent upon any kind of subjectivity. I wouldn't die on the hill that slavery is an objective moral fact, but it is to me an egregious moral fact. In other words, that it is impermissible under any conditions. Do I think it should never be the case where you can ever own a slave? And when God is giving people the rules on what you have to do, whether you're a Jew or a Gentile, and how it differs in the owning the slave, that does seem to be at least condoning it. And now I've heard the argument before, and I'll have to ask Dr. Bowen about this, but I've heard the argument before. Some people were like, well, they also allowed for divorce. And Moses, doesn't Jesus say something to the effect, if I remember correctly, about Reason why they allowed for divorce is because the people wanted it, and so God kind of said, whatever, I'll let you have this one. But he didn't do that with slavery, which I think is a far greater issue. And so when you're saying that, the Bible doesn't condone slavery, everything in it seems to be the case that at the very least, if it's not saying, hey, you should own a slave, it's complicit about it. It doesn't explicitly ever say don't ever do it. And I have an issue with that, even with the Levitical code. In any of the mitzvahs, it doesn't talk about it. It doesn't say you don't ever own a slave, period.
There are very clear statements in the covenantal code that kidnapping is punishable by death. So here you're
kidnapping is not the same as slavery.
Well, when you've kidnapped somebody, you've essentially robbed them of their freedom, and you've brought their lives under your control. And so, by virtue of that idea that kidnapping again is clearly condemned, is I think a very forthright statement about the idea that you should not treat another human being as property. And in fact, when you look at the type of relationships that people are interpreting as slavery, again, that are described in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, these are not situations where one individual is owning another individual. These are situations where there are arrangements that are being made between two individuals on a voluntary basis, where if anything, one person might own the labor of another person, but they don't own that individual. And the covenantal code is being put in place to actually prevent the oppression and the abuse of people who are vulnerable people because of having debts that they're unable to pay, because they're poor, because they're foreigners, because they're widows or orphans. And so as part of that, there are these restrictions that are being put in place that are actually preventing the ownership of one person by another person. These passages in no way, shape, or form are describing chattel slavery or the ownership of one person by another person.
But that argument kind of is like, it's for their own good. We're doing this for their own good kind of argument. And you mentioned kidnapping. Kidnapping is just depriving somebody of their liberty to leave. Slavery is you're depriving them of their humanity. There's a huge distinction to be had there. And you say there wasn't chattel, but it effectively was. If they are not free to leave on their own accord, that is slavery. There's punishments if they try to leave. That's more than just kidnapping. Again, actually, there's a humanistic thing for slavery where you are treating them as less than a person.
Actually, in the covenantal code, if somebody who is in a debt servant relationship or is in a agreed upon a relationship between a non-Israelite and a Hebrew lord, if you will, that if that person flees, they cannot be returned back to that relationship, that they have to be protected. And so they're not forced into that relationship. If they find that situation to be abusive or not to their liking, they're able to flee. And the covenantal code protected them. Is
that strictly for debt?
No, it's all for both.
Okay, gentlemen, I want to jump in here. I don't know if this is going to be a question for Josh, where it would be good to bring him in soon, but I wanted to ask about the kidnapping. Either one of you can answer this. If kidnapping, we're picturing if someone kidnaps another person and then sells them, the Bible says that whoever is in possession of that person that was kidnapped and sold and now owns that person that is owning the slave now is to be put to death because the human being was kidnapped. So I understand that kidnapping is not the equivalent of slavery. I get that. How are these slaves being acquired? And is slavery across the board? When we talk about slaves, Hebrew slaves in the Old Testament, are we talking about there's one type of slavery, or is there different types of slaves? And again, I don't know if that's for you two gentlemen or Josh.
Well,
I mean, there are 4 words that are used that are unfortunately translated in some instances as slavery, but it's Evid, which is essentially somebody who would be equivalent to a servant. There is a Hebrew word that's used to describe somebody that's a hired hand, hired labor. And then there's also two words that are used to describe females that are either handmaidens or servants. So there's no word that would, I think, appropriately be translated as slavery in the original Hebrew.
But the concepts are there, though, right? I mean, Exodus and Leviticus, they both say, if you buy a Hebrew servant, buy means to purchase, meaning your property. You are owned by somebody if you're buying somebody. It's not kidnapping. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve you for 6 years. But in the 7th year, he should go free without paying anything. And also, if your male and female slaves are come from the nations around you, from them you may buy slaves. So these are purchasing of a person.
Okay, well, but that's the
purchasing property.
That's the purchasing of the person. That's the after whoever owns it is selling the person. The person who owns the slave is selling it. How do they acquire it?
Neither is correct, because that word that's translated as buy can also mean acquire. And so for the passage you're referring to, Steve, is Exodus. One of them is Exodus 21:2, right? And there, I think the proper understanding of that word is acquire, because if you go to the corresponding passage in Leviticus, which is in Leviticus 25 or Deuteronomy 15, it's very clear that this is a situation where somebody who is a Hebrew has essentially has so much debt that they're unable to pay that debt to the person they owe it to. So they can, under those circumstances, can enter into a voluntary relationship where they become a debt servant, where they're exchanging their labor for payment of their debt. But as part of that, the Lord, who they are now in service to, has to provide them with room and board. But it's a temporary situation. The way to think of this is a welfare system where after 6 years, they are to be released, and on their release, they are to be provided with resources to help them to become reestablished. You also have the year of Jubilee, which is every 50 years. Everybody that is in a household that is in some kind of service relationship to the master of the household has to be released, has to be granted their freedom. And this would include both Israelites and non-Israelites as well. So it's hard to argue that this is actually a system of slavery or of ownership. This is actually a welfare system that is really for the benefit of those people that have essentially wound up in a situation where they're unable to pay their debts. In the case of,
you make it sound like it's a wage labor thing between a contract between an employee and employer.
It is an arrangement.
That's not how I read. That's not how I read. I think Dr. Bowen would be good to bring in. Yes.
Yeah, let's bring in Josh. I want to hear him chime in on this, just so everybody knows this. We are welcoming Dr. Josh Bowen. He's very well versed in this. He earned his PhD in Assyriology with a minor in Hebrew Bible from Johns Hopkins. He also received a Fulbright scholarship to work on Sumerian religion and literature. He also has a book that, Josh, I'll let you tell a little bit more about, that you can find on Amazon. Also, it is linked into the description on this video if you'd like to check out his book. But Josh, please help us jump in here, because save us, because I still am not 100% clear. I do hear Fuz saying that there is the type of slavery where we're calling it slavery, where someone basically indentures themselves and sells themselves to pay off a debt that they're cared for. Is this across the board? Is this what slavery looked like? I know that the slavery we're familiar with in the West is kidnapping a person, taking them against their will. Is slavery across the board in the Old Testament? Is it all equal? Help us out.
Well, there was a lot, I guess, to think about. I took some notes, but I don't want to present a big response. So I guess we can do it this way. I guess we can just talk about individual things. But basically, in the ancient Near East, which ancient Israelite society is part of that. you have fundamentally two types of slavery. You have debt slavery and chattel slavery. So debt slavery is, essentially contingent upon a debt. So if you have somebody that comes into slavery in any way, and that slavery is contingent upon the payment of that debt, that's debt slavery. Usually that's temporary. It can sometimes contract stipulations will say after a certain period of time, if redemption is not made of that individual, it can turn into permanent slavery, which would then be chattel slavery. You can see this in Middle Assyrian laws or Old Assyrian laws. But, this is what you see in, most scholars would say, in Exodus 21, Deuteronomy 15. Chattel slavery, on the other hand, is just permanent, right? It's not contingent upon a debt. So Exodus 21, and I think people sometimes miss this. When you have an Eved Ivri, a Hebrew slave coming in for the 6-year period, if he is given a wife by his master, the children that are born are chattel slaves, right? They are what they call Yalid Bait. They're like children of the house. And this is something it's not just in the Hebrew Bible, it's very common in the ancient Near East. They belong to the master. And this is the quandary that the Hebrew servant finds himself in, the debt slave finds himself in. Do I leave my probably slave wife and children that are now, the master's property, and go out on my own, or do I stay with them and make a lifelong dedication? So that's the crux of the passage. But those are the two types of slavery that we see. Houseborn slaves, war captives, chattel slaves. What you see in Leviticus 25, 44 to 46, chattel slaves, because it's permanent. That's the point. It's there is no debt upon which this slavery is contingent.
Is that similar to the 1600s, the Latin term partus sequitur ventrum, from the belly, that which is brought forth from the belly, that the children of the slaves were considered to be slaves themselves?
Yeah, I mean, the point, I think, is that one of the things that's a little cringeworthy, maybe, that we don't like to think about too much in Exodus 21, is that the first 11 verses, 2 through 11, are sort of setting up the sexual use of a male slave and a female slave. That's what it's setting up. So, a male slave, he's able to be used to breed slaves. That's what he can do. And there's no status change required because, in ancient Near Eastern culture, there isn't some detriment that befalls a man for having sex, as far as his value is concerned. However, with the Amma, the female slave, the reason that the text goes to such great lengths to protect her is because when she is taken as a female slave, either as a concubine or as a wife, once that is consummated, her status has to be elevated in some way. So that's why the text says you can't, if the husband says I don't like her anymore for whatever reason, can't just sell her. She doesn't go back down to the status of a regular slave. She's been elevated, so she either has to be allowed to be redeemed or she has to be provided for. Her status is elevated, and that is because, as we just see in the ancient Near East, virginity is incredibly important for a woman. So,
Josh, if I just may interact with some points that you're making here, and then give you a chance to respond. I think there's first of all a couple of places where you and I probably have some fundamental differences, I would say, in terms of the way we would exegete these passages. So, for example, I think it is appropriate to recognize that ancient Israel was obviously within the ancient Near East, right? It was part of that milieu. And I think in your book, you actually do, in my opinion, a really good job of, in a lay-friendly way, of describing what life was like in the ancient Near East when it comes to the idea of slavery. So I thought that was really well done. But from my perspective, I think the important point here is not to interpret the covenantal code in light of the codes of the ancient Near East, but rather to interpret the covenantal code on its own merits, recognizing that there are unique features to it. So, as I've read through the Code of Hammurabi in comparison with the covenantal code, it becomes very clear to me that in the Code of Hammurabi, slaves are actually treated as property. And that becomes really apparent in the part of the code that deals with what happens if a third party injures or kills another person's slave, because the recourse is essentially payment to the master or to the owner. But in the covenantal code, you see something very different, where if there's injury or the killing of a debt servant, that they actually that injury, if it's caused by the master, is grounds for immediate release from the arrangement. And if it's death, that then the master is actually, or the lord is actually then put to death himself. And so to me, that's very different, because there's no punishment in the Code of Hammurabi, at least as I understand it, for a master who brings about the injury or the death of somebody that he owns, that is his slave. So I think there's some unique features to the covenantal code. So I would read the code, the covenantal code, on its own merits and understand it on its own merits, granted that it is part of the ancient Near East. But another place too is I actually.
Do you mind? Sorry, Fuz. I have MS, please. So I will lose every point.
Yeah. Go ahead.
If you don't mind.
Sorry. No, go ahead.
So as I've written them down, so I'm trying to stay with you. So we talk about the covenant code. So covenant code, Exodus 21. It's like 20 to 23. The Deuteronomistic laws of Deuteronomy 15 about slavery, and then the holiness code of Leviticus 25, just so we can kind of keep the language here clear. Wright wrote a book, 2010 maybe, where I wouldn't say that I agree with everything that he's saying, but there's very clear scholarly consensus on Exodus 21, either directly being built upon the laws of Hammurabi, as Wright would argue. I apologize, if you guys can hear that yelling, that's my dog doing something really bad, apparently. So people like Raymond Westbrook, this is somebody that died in 2009 from Hopkins, but worked extensively. Also Bruce Wells, ancient Near Eastern law scholars. These are people that, like, probably, if the audience is interested in this, those are names to know. There is, what would we call it, like a legal tradition that stands behind the laws of the ancient Near East. So one of the things that's very clear is the ox goring incident that you see in Exodus 21, right? So you mentioned how, I'm assuming that you're referring to Exodus 21, 20 to 21, where it says, if a man beats his male or female slave with a wooden rod, and they die immediately, then there's to be, he's to indeed be punished, right? The word nakam there probably means death. We don't really know, but whatever. But if he survives a day or two, whether he dies, whether he lives after that, there is no punishment, for he is his silver, he's his property, is his money, whatever, however you want to do that. So the death penalty, let's say, for killing what is probably a debt slave there. This is what we see actually in the laws of Hammurabi. So a pledge that is taken in the laws of Hammurabi, if a master, has a claim against, if a creditor has a claim against a debtor and takes like a female slave, or takes a son, or takes a daughter, or takes a wife, and beats that slave, or that pledge, that distrainee, so that that individual dies. If it is a free man or a free woman or a free child, the master's son is killed, right? It's lex talionis. So this is something that's sort of seen in the law codes. It's really not as different, I think. And then I'll be quiet. just trying to hit the points. In the ox goring incident, this is one of the places that you really do see continuity in the laws of the ancient Near East, because and it's a place that's startling, I think, when we read it, because if you read through what happens with the ox in Exodus 21, if this ox gores a free man, a free woman, a free daughter, or a free son, sorry, they're vacuuming upstairs. I'm going to mute once I finish the sentence. Then that master is killed, right? The master of the ox, the owner of the ox, is killed. That didn't. Yeah. But if it kills a slave, there's a 30 shekel penalty, which is not small, potatoes, but it's a fixed price and it's paid to the owner of the slave. So there's distinction. There's actually confusion, if you want to call it, but it's not so straightforward in the covenant code.
Well, the way I read that particular passage, and I've spent quite a bit of time going through that passage in detail. What I think is going on there is that if there's a person that has an ox in it and it kills another person, and it was an unexpected event, then the ox is killed. If that owner knew that the ox was prone to that behavior, then that owner is to be killed. However, it looks to me like there's a provision that if the people that are injured who lost a loved one agree that instead of him being put to death, there can be some kind of demand, some kind of monetary demand. And that could be for, if it's the husband, then the family could ask a demand as opposed to putting him to death. Or if it's a child, then again, there could be a demand placed on it. And the way I look at it too is that as the debt servant is part of that household, there can also be that demand put on the owner of the ox, but that if it's a debt servant, that there is at least a minimum payment that must be made, recognizing that there was this monetary or this financial arrangement between the debt servant and the Lord or the master. So that's how I'm reading it. So I don't see it as that the owner of the ox is off the hook. I don't see it that way.
Oh no, he's definitely not off the hook.
No, but in other words, that he could also wind up with the death penalty if the person that was killed was a debt servant. So in other words, what that text is saying is he's either put to death regardless of who's killed, or if the injured parties want to demand monetary payment, then that is an option that is available to them. So it's not either or, but it's a kind of a both and, I guess.
See, I'm way off on this because I have a way different take on this. Maybe it's just me because I'm completely hosed on the Bible then. But I thought you know about Exodus 21:19?
No, this is 32.
Okay, because I was thinking, because the whole thing I know about the ox is that if it happens once, it's no big deal. They go, okay, but if the ox is known to have gored people before, that's when you have to eat the ox and put it to death. So,
okay, the issue of lex talionis, right, the law of retribution. Karen Radner up at the Oriental Institute recently did on YouTube did a lecture. It's actually really, really good. And a Syriologist. Lex talionis likely played out as we see it here in Exodus 21, where, if I say to you, Dr. Rana, if I say to you, all right, well, you put out my eye, I want your eye, right? That doesn't really do me a lot of good, right? So the rationale behind this, and she makes a very convincing argument, and of course she's not alone, is that what are you willing to pay to keep your eye? That's the point. That's the point of lex talionis. So if you say, well, I need my eye to, be a leather worker or to do whatever it is that I will give you a mina of silver to keep my eye. And if I say, hey, I'm good with that, how do you value what it is that my eye is worth, right? The problem with this is that when you have a free man, free woman, free daughter, free son, lex talionis applies, right? So then you do get to have this, I get to say to you, I demand that you're I, and you say, "Oh, well, what can I give you?" With a slave, it's 30 shekels of silver, and it's paid to the owner of the slave that was lost. In other words, this is property law. That's what's going on here. It's property law.
Well, but I would I guess take a differing perspective on that, in part because what's interesting in that particular passage of Exodus is that the word that is used to describe the person that owns the cattle is actually a different word than the word that's used to translate, that is translated as master, which would be referring to the person that, again, is in that debt service relationship with the debt servant. And so that by virtue of the fact that there's very different words that are being used to describe the relationship between the Lord and the debt servant versus the owner and the ox, suggests that it's not the same kind of ownership, but rather it's essentially paying, the Lord for the lost wages. I mean, he doesn't have any other relationship to that debt servant. So
if it were a debt servant, I mean, if it were a debt servant, right? And you wanted to argue for this sort of equality, what you would expect then is what you see in Exodus 21:20, right? Ostensibly, what we're looking at, I think, and it's debated. Some people see it as a foreign chattel slave, and other people see it as a debt slave. I tend to think it's a debt slave. It seems to work better. But this nakam, this vengeance that's going to be taken out, is ostensibly being taken out by the family, right? Because it's a debt slave. Debt slavery, the property, the money, whatever of that debt slave does not vest in the master, right? It's not an you don't own the personhood of the individual. It's a debt slave. You own the right to that debt and the labor to get that debt paid off. Which, by the way, in the laws of Hammurabi, they work for 3 years and they're released in the 4th. Whereas in the Hebrew Bible, it's for 6 years, and then they're released in the 7th. But they're still debt slaves. So you would expect, and we can move on past this. I'm sorry, I feel like I'm dragging on. But you would expect that the debt slave, that if it were a debt slave and it were lex talionis, that the family of the debt slave would be able to say, "I demand life for life." But they don't.
If it's a debt slave, how much do you think is tailored to more retributive justice versus restorative justice?
Oh, I think it's almost, I would say it's all restorative.
It's all restorative. Okay.
Yeah,
So that itself is you want to be made whole, right? So it's not a matter of just retribution. In that particular case, if it's a debt slave, it is going to be for restorative purposes, right?
Right. I mean, I think it's probably a chattel slave, but it's not terribly relevant, I suppose. It's one of the things that.
Yeah, but I guess I have a hard time to see how this actually has any bearing on the question: is slavery actually being condoned? I don't think. I mean, I don't think this.
Oh, sorry, I'm just addressing the things that you brought up. That's all.
Yeah. Okay.
We can move on to like Leviticus 25. I think that's probably where most people are. I mean,
as we're actually having this conversation, something that I think is important to recognize as we're talking about the covenantal code, and that is that these, at least in the case of Exodus and Deuteronomy, these are essentially laws that are used to kind of elaborate on the 10 commandments. So in Exodus 20, the 10 commandments are given. In Deuteronomy, the 14, I think the 10 commandments are given. And then you see an elaboration of those 10 commandments in the covenantal code. But what's going on here is, in many instances, this elaboration is in the form of causative law or case law, where it's not essentially describing situations that God is actually prescribing, but rather is saying that in these less than perfect circumstances, in these non-desirable circumstances, if these are the things that happen, then this is what you can do to ensure that everybody's interest is essentially maintained, and that you're doing it in such a way to show respect and dignity and value to those people that are most vulnerable in society. So these in many instances are not ideal circumstances, are not what God is prescribing, if you will, but rather are, if this is happening, then these are the things that you can do to try to bring about, something that would approach justice. And I think it's really important.
If I could jump in, I have a question for you, Fuz. The conversation about bringing dignity and humanity and God kind of putting parameters on that. I am still torn between the meme that is said tongue in cheek of God he did say no shellfish, easy peasy. Whether or not people obeyed it or not, where God stands on shellfish. But he didn't say no slavery, and I think that there's a parsing of words here of, well, it's more of an employee or whatever. And I'm even seeing that in the chat that a lot of people are chiming in that it's more of an indentured servant. But again, I have the sticking point where Josh even brought it up of, I can't beat my hired servant to the point of almost death and then say, well, as long as he lives, or she, there's a more emotionally charged thing. I could beat the woman almost to death, but as long as she lives for a day or two, then we good. So how is this?
In my opinion, this is where the idea of causative law comes in. And of course, we need to read these passages now in the context of Proverbs, where there's, in a couple of places it talks about the use of the rod as a way to instruct, to provide discipline and correction to children. And that's also used to provide instruction and discipline and correction to those people that are in your service, right? And to me, the idea here is that you've got a patriarchal society where there's a head of a household, and that head of the household has, if you will, parental responsibilities to the entire household. And part of that is to ensure that providing instruction, providing discipline and correction. And so I hardly think that and a rod, by the way, was not a weapon. It was essentially an implement of discipline.
But it still caused bodily harm. I mean, if those were the rules nowadays, those people would be in jail.
No, but the idea was that you were supposed to strike people in areas that were non-vulnerable. Right?
Look, I don't want to be struck anywhere. To me, assault and battery is still assault and battery.
Well, I'd have a hard time arguing that a parent spanking a child is actually immoral, right? Or is
well, I mean, okay. But, I mean, granted, I think spanking is going to be a little bit different. But when you beat somebody to the inch of their life, that to me would be morally
but wait a minute,
egregious,
Steve. Wait a minute, Steve. I understand your point, but this is where the causative law becomes really important, or this concept.
Casuistic. Is casuistic.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, thank you. No, sure. Appreciate it. Biochemist here, not a
no. Hey, I hear you.
Not a biblical scholar.
Don't ask me anything scientific.
But in a sense, it's again case law, where the idea here is that it is okay to administer correction to your servant, but if you beat them, if you go to the extreme that you are either killing them, your life is going to be required of you. That right away says that this debt servant is not property, but is actually equivalent to you, is a human being that is equivalent to you. Or if you injure them, if you strike them in the eye, or they lose an eye or lose a tooth, that means you're hitting them in the head. That's a vulnerable area that they are immediately granted release from the contract. And if they're injured, then, and they're able to get up and recover from that, well, then the idea here is that because they are your means of earning income, you are punished, or your retribution, or your, is that you lost that person's labor for that period of time. So I don't see this as being, saying that it's okay to beat your servant. It's essentially saying, if this happens, in other words, that passage is actually putting restrictions on what the Lord or the master can do in the household.
But how does that follow? That's not property. I mean, look.
Yeah,
look,
the Bible verse actually says, the Bible verse says the qualifier is because they are your property.
No, it's because they are your silver.
Property is a fine translation.
So let's say that, like, nowadays,
it is
nowadays animal.
Well,
animals,
the Hebrew word there,
it's kesef. Yes, I know what the Hebrew word is, and
it's silver.
Its property is absolutely fine.
All right. Well, let me make this, throw this out there. Nowadays, when you have an animal is considered to be personal property. Okay. Doesn't mean you could beat them. It still means that you have to treat them humanely. There's still laws in effect that came from man to say, hey, you know what? If you have an animal, you have a stewardship of it. You're not allowed to beat them in any degree, right? But 2,000 years ago, it seemed to be that the case. You're allowed to beat somebody to inch their life, whether they're property or not. Nowadays, animals are property, yet we treat them more humane than what it seems like the biblical did to their slaves.
Would it be okay if I just want to say something that I think is germane to this? So it's interesting and probably not terribly well known. It wasn't to me anyway. That the laws in the antebellum South are actually quite similar to Exodus 21. So, which is very surprising to people, right? We always hear this. Well, they're much better in the antebellum South. It's not. Actually, the laws are pretty close in this regard. So if particularly following the revolution, and if people want to read about this, Tom Morris has a book out. I can get anyway. But if a slave died in the antebellum South in circumstances other than mild correction, it was like murdering a white person. Right, that's what they considered it, murder, and they considered that the penalty, in particular in Virginia, but you couldn't just go murder a slave if you beat them. And they said, well, if it's moderate correction was what the law said, then there wouldn't be punishment. But if it was more than moderate correction, and the problem is that nobody would make the argument today that that's okay. Right, and if you look at what loopholes that created, it wasn't the point of the law. Right. If you read what some of these justices say, they say, like, no good Christian would do these types of egregious things, to beat them, outright. That wasn't the point of the law. And I think Fuz is absolutely right here. Right. That the point of the text is not to say, all right, here's the way you can beat them and get away with it. The point of the law is to say, look, Proverbs 29:19-21 makes it very clear that slaves are not motivated by words alone, right? So it's absolutely recommended that you discipline a slave with a wooden rod, but be careful how you do it. That's the point of the law. And if you beat them if you beat them, as Dr. Rana said, probably about the head, and they died immediately under the hand, well, then probably death penalty. That's probably what nakam means there. And if you hit them in the face, knock out a tooth, knock out an eye, what it is it's evidence that you're not disciplining them. It's evidence that there's malice behind it. That's probably the way to take that. So I agree. This is a protection, actually. The problem is that we wouldn't beat our kids with a wooden rod. I wouldn't. And so I think we've evolved past that.
Yeah, if you just had the rule, don't hit somebody, you wouldn't need protections of that degree, correct?
Yeah, of course, from their perspective, they're thinking, well, wait a minute, this slave, once he's here, he knows he's got to be here for 6 years. What's his motivation? If I can't hit him, right? Now, I think that's bad, right? I think it's bad to have a slave, and I think it's bad to beat a slave. But if you're going to have the slave, this is why the law is there in place, and it's saying, look, you can correct him. You read through Proverbs, you're supposed to hit them on the back. That's where fools are normally struck. Children are probably struck. So, but again, so I think there's a middle
So
There's a middle
you're
ground
saying that
here.
the intent behind that, and by the way, I'm not disagreeing with either of you. I think you're probably right. But you're saying though that the reason why it was written the way it was more of a protection.
Yes.
Okay, but let me throw this out there. Was it protection from man writing that, or was it protection from a God writing that? Because if these are the words of God, God is saying, look, I want to protect these slaves that allowed for slavery to happen in the first place.
So this is where I think, and you guys, you can go wherever you want with this, but I think this is where Leviticus 25 is actually really important, not because of verses 44 to 46. But so just very, very briefly, most scholars, I would say probably all but Van Cedars would say that the covenant code in Exodus came first, then the Deuteronomistic laws probably came in the late 7th century, then the holiness code came later, maybe in the Persian period, who knows, but whatever. But that's the progression, right? Now, I know, Dr. Rana, we'd probably disagree on this. That's okay. But let me just lay it out from this perspective. When you get to Leviticus 25 is turning Exodus 21 on its head. If you remember, Exodus 21 says, if you have a Hebrew slave, this is what you have to do. When you get to Leviticus 25, it says, if an Israelite falls into such poverty, you cannot treat them as an eved. That's done. You have to treat them as a sahir, as Dr. Ron was talking about, a hired worker. And you have to, you have to treat them this way. You can't treat them like an eved. And you have to release them at the year of Jubilee, which it's debated whether that's good for them or not, but the text is trying to present it as good. So slavery by this point is not a good thing, right? It's just not a good thing for Israelites. And this is why the question comes up in verse 44. Concerning your male and female slaves, whom you will have, you'll get them from the nations around you. You get them from the Toshavim, the tenant farmers living in your midst, keep them for life, pass them down as inheritance to your property, blah, 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 blah. But that's where you're getting eveds now. If you want slaves, they got to come from non-Israelites. You can't take Israelites as slaves. So the law does develop, and it develops to the point you can't have Hebrew slaves anymore. That's done.
Yeah, see, and I would take a differing perspective. I do agree that the laws that you see in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy weren't given all at once. That there was this historical progression, but it also is, I think, in the context of what was happening to the nation of Israel. So to me, I see the laws that are presented in Exodus 20. Again, are an elaboration on the 10 Commandments, where again, it's case law that if these are the things that happen, this is how you in real life live out these different facets of the 10 Commandments, the different commandments that were given to Moses. But this is when Israel has just exited a situation of slavery in Egypt. Then you have the laws in Leviticus. These are the holiness laws, right? These are essentially given to the Levites, the priests of Israel, as a way to, this is how you, again, respect and honor and worship and engage Yahweh. And then there's this passage where, be holy like I'm holy. And so part of the laws in Leviticus are, how do you live out, again, a life that is holy before God? And again, there's case law there saying that if this happens, that happens. But in both Exodus and Leviticus, particularly in the case law, there is essentially restatements, but also elaborations or things that were implicit in one case are made explicit. And likewise with Deuteronomy, this is where Israel is about to enter into the promised land. And again, there's an elaboration on the 10 Commandments where there are new concepts that are being introduced that weren't necessarily introduced in Exodus and Leviticus, in part because of the context, the historical context for the nation of Israel, or what the nation of Israel was experiencing. But to me, again, a lot of places, what was implicit is made explicit. So I read Deuteronomy 15 in Leviticus 25 in conjunction with Exodus 21, where I see them as making a coherent picture that is not contradictory, but is just in one case being more explicit than the other.
Let me jump in here, Fuz. We are having so much fun with all three of you that we're kind of taking up our time just here, and we've got so many people that have questions. And Fuz, you were saying something that I want to direct. I want to move us over to our audience and our viewers right now that are asking some fantastic questions. And one of the things you just intimated, Fuz, I'll let you take it, and then Josh, if you want to approach the exact same question. Dwaller, I believe is how we say the name here, asked the question, is there not an argument here that falls under the category of progressive revelation, or I've heard a pedagogical system that God has, that basically God is working with the maturity that man has at said point in time, and you're giving different examples, Fuz, in scripture. How would you, Fuz, address that? And Josh, how would you address it?
Yeah, I don't know that I would see in Christianity a progression in the moral law going from Israel into the New Testament. I think it's the law is the law. Now, granted, again, as I mentioned, that what you see in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy are, in many instances, they overlap with each other. There's a restatement of the case laws that you see there, where there's some instances things are made more explicit. But I see that the law has to be read as a package, and in fact, that's how the prophets are looking at the laws. Amos and Isaiah, when they're condemning human trafficking, that's how Paul is looking at the laws. He's looking at it as a package, and so I think that's the way you need to understand the laws. I don't see it as a progression as sorts, or a progression of morality. I just don't see it that way. And again, I think it's really important that you're reading. You don't read any one of the laws in isolation. You've got to read that law or that bit of the law in light of the larger covenantal code.
Josh, you or Steve, do you see any pedagogical maturing here? Or?
I'll be brief because Dr. Bowen is going to definitely
forget it.
Yeah, so I'll just throw my 2 cents in real quick. That nobody really cares. So I don't think it's pedagogical at all, because if God's going to give that kind of instruction on a precept by precept basis, right? And I'm fine with heuristic type learning. I get that, a lot of people are not going to understand certain concepts at the very beginning. When I was in school, one of the first things they would say is, hey, you're not going to understand this right now. You'll learn later on why that is. And I get that. But when it's something to this egregiousness of slavery to a moral code, I think it is much better explained that humans learned, we shouldn't have slavery naturally through sociological, through evolution, through the fact that, hey, owning people's bad, that is a discovery that we made over a period of time. That would be an epistemological knowledge that we have acquired through observation, learning, trial, and error. That God, being the being that he is, could have just said right off the bat, hey, this is bad, don't do it.
And I think this is really the problem that we face if we're going to take, for example, if you're going to see Deuteronomy sort of at the end of this, what you have to see then is a progression of Israelites, Hebrew slaves, they're okay. Then in Leviticus, they're not okay. Then in Deuteronomy 15, they're okay again, right? There's a problem seeing it that way. There's actually quite a bit of logic to this. And this is sort of the progression that I would see here. So if you look at the laws in Exodus 21, it's, if you have a Hebrew slave, keep him for 6 years, set him free. When you get to Deuteronomy 15, it's you have him for 6 years, set him free. But when you do, you got to give him all kinds of stuff from your wine press, from your, all this provision so that they don't fall back into poverty. There's a development here. When you get to Leviticus 25, it's no more. Can you have, it's explicit. 39 to 43, it's explicit. You cannot take an Israelite, a Hebrew slave, any longer. You can't do it. They have to be a hired worker. They have to stay with you. So what I would argue, this problem with this sort of progressive view, is that by the time you get to Leviticus 25, there's been some development that says slavery's not good, but it's only not good for Israelites. You can keep foreigners, right? So in other words, I guess what I'm saying is, if God can say it's not good to keep slaves of Israelites, why does he not then? I think he would have a good case for this if he would then say you can't keep slaves at all,
Yeah,
but he
at all,
doesn't.
total.
It's just slaves bad for Israel.
Yeah.
I think that really dovetails well into the next question from Dave Wu. Dave Wu asked the question, were slaves an economic necessity due to the social construct? If I could add a context to that, to a conversation I recently had with a friend who served over in Thailand with a ministry that was bringing people out of sex trafficking. If they had the power to completely end sex trafficking right then, just pull everybody out and to shut it down, it is such a huge financial support, economic support in that country that the country would literally implode. It would collapse financially until there is a growing, a moving away of that as income. I'm wondering, along with Dave Wu's question about slaves being an economic necessity, if God had said, no more slavery, done now, what would have the impact have been? Could that feed into it?
Doesn't that dovetail to what he was saying about the antebellum days when you had cotton as being a huge cash crop and slave for that for economic reasons? I mean, wouldn't that dovetail right into that?
I think
Yeah.
the problem.
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Josh. No, Josh, you please go ahead.
See, the thing is, the problem with this argument is that God does do this, right? It is an economic problem. That's why when you look at Deuteronomy 15 and he says, hey, give them a bunch of stuff from your own supplies, don't ask yourself, how am I going to do this, right? I will supernaturally provide for you. The same is true with the, in Leviticus 25, particularly going to Leviticus 26, supernatural provision it's the thing. Right. So when he says, every seventh year, let the land lie fallow, and don't ask yourself, what are we going to eat? Because I will supernaturally provide for you so much that you'll actually get more. Right. So the two things are, I would say, that God does ask them to do things that he says specifically will be economically problematic. And that's one of the reasons that they won't want to do them. And his response is, I got it. I will supernaturally take care of this. And it is what he does in Leviticus 25 when he says, no more Hebrew slaves, right? So the supernatural provision is the thing that is the response, I think, to this problem of economic, because you're absolutely right. It was economically part of their system. But that's what God is hanging this on.
God's just saying, have faith. He'll take care of you.
I'll do it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and let me engage this point, because again, when I look at Leviticus 25:39, I don't see that as saying you don't have slaves anymore, because again, it says, if any of your fellow Israelites become poor and sell themselves to you, that again is describing this debt servant relationship. And so this to me,
keep reading though. Like
yeah,
the next phrase is
and
the
they are
key.
to be treated as hired workers or temporary residents among you, and they are to work until the year of Jubilee. And so
I think you skipped the do not make them do the work of a slave, right? That you're not to make them work as a slave.
If any of your fellow Israelites become poor and sell themselves to you,
do not make them work as slaves. Yeah, you're right. I didn't do that intentionally.
No, that's fine.
I'm reading on
I do that all the time.
Yeah, the eyes are failing, so I apologize for that. But I look at this again in light of Exodus 21:2, and in light of Deuteronomy 15, whatever, the 7 or whatever, where it's essentially describing, again, this debt servant relationship, where this is just simply elaborating on the details of how this debt servant relationship should work. Where I see this as a welfare system is not. It is an economic necessity in that you want to have some means by which those people that are poor, that are unable to pay their debts, are able to be rescued from that circumstance. So that's how I see this passage. What I see happening in Leviticus 25:44 and onward is, with regard to non-Israelites, is that that becomes a source of labor. So I would agree with that these non-Israelites can become a source of labor. But there, because they are foreigners, because they are not Israelites, you are able to enter into a long-term, a lifelong, kind of servant Lord relationship with them. But I see this as actually a way for both sides to be mutually benefited in this way, because foreigners that would come to Israel that wanted to remain there as residents were not able to own land. And so in order to provide, for them, the foreigners, if you read in Leviticus, are treated as marginalized people, as the poor, as the widows, as the orphans and the foreigners, that there were these, that you were to treat them like you would treat a fellow Hebrew, that you were not to exploit them. You're to pay them the wages that they are due if they're hired hands or hired workers. That you were to leave behind food after you harvested so that they could glean, and that if that it was a voluntary situation, because again, you couldn't kidnap, you couldn't force people into slavery, that if they agreed to work with you with a lifelong commitment, in a lifelong arrangement, then that was permissible, that you didn't have to release them after 6 years, but they still would be released in the year of Jubilee, according to Leviticus. And so the idea here is that this provides them economic security, because they know that they are in this lifelong contract, that they can't be just simply cast aside, that they become part of the household, and they could convert, if they wanted to, and become part of the community of Israel. So I see this as a way to provide labor for landowners in Israel, but also as a means to provide economic security for foreigners, because I think that all the provisions and restrictions on, the Lord in terms of how he's to treat the Hebrew debt servant applies to the foreigner who's in that debt service.
We have a lot of questions to get through.
But this
actually,
is sorry, but this is the key passage, and if I could have just 2 minutes to,
of course,
please
push back. So one, the toshav, the person that we're one of the key people that we're talking about here in verse 44 to 46. If you keep reading, starting in verse 47, these are the same people that become exceptionally wealthy in the land. What these are probably tenant farmers, right? As you said, Dr. Ronald, they can't own land because they're not Israelites, but that doesn't mean they become poor. They can become very, very wealthy to the point that they can get their own Hebrew slaves. That's why 47 to, whatever it is, the end of the chapter there deals with what do you do if a Hebrew slave, a Hebrew Israelite goes in and becomes the slave of one of these foreigners. The issue here is that Leviticus 25, just in the audience, just go read it. I mean, if you just read it in the English, the contrast, the point of the text is the contrast. It's particularly starting in verse 39. It says the year of Jubilee applies to the Israelite and his household. 50th year, they go free back to their land gets returned to them, everything goes, but not the foreigner. The whole point of the text is you can't treat an Israelite like an Eved any longer. The year of Jubilee applies and everybody goes back. It's the same sort of thing that you see in the ancient Near Eastern laws, Meshuram edicts, where King Hammurabi says every citizen go back free, no more debt slaves, everybody's released. This is not unique to the Hebrew Bible. The problem is that Israelites are the only ones that it's applicable to. So it's not applicable to the foreigner, explicitly not applicable to the foreigner, because those individuals, those Eveds and Amaz are able, they're achuzah. Achuzah means landed property, except here. It's the only place that it ever refers to a human. It means property that becomes part of their inheritance. It's passed down, it stays with them, their children, it remains. They're not released to the Jubilee. And this is just regular consensus scholarship.
Well, but if you go to Leviticus 25, verse 10, it says, consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. And that expression, all its inhabitants, would include the non-Israelites as
It doesn't.
well.
It doesn't.
There are scholars I read who argued that expression,
I would like to hear.
All its inhabitants is essentially used elsewhere to refer to everybody that's associated with a particular geographical region. So
whom would you cite?
Isaac Allen would be one.
So from the 1860s.
Yes.
Is there anybody more recently?
Well, but he makes a biblical argument, based on how that expression is used throughout the Old Testament, and always refers to all of the people that are part of a particular.
I'm not trying to be cheeky, but this is, if you just translate through the text, this is the point of the text. And it's not my opinion, right? This is conservative, liberal. I can go pull evangelical scholars off the shelf now. This is the point of Leviticus.
Well, let me ask you guys, because it goes to the heart of the question, does God, is pro-slavery or condoning some, what would it matter in the case of, like, Dr. Bowen, you're saying it doesn't apply to the Gentiles, it does to, or the Hebrews, Israelites, it does to the foreigners, okay? And Dr. Run is saying it applies equally. From a morality point of view, I mean, I definitely think that there's a distinction to be made here. If it is the case that God is saying, hey, look, it applies to one group of people, but not to another, there are some issues to be had there, moralistically speaking. Would you not agree?
Well, I mean, that's a great question, Steve. And the way there's not real, in my view, and Josh, I think you do a really good job of this in your book, actually, is pointing out that what you're looking at in the ancient Near East is a system that we are not really familiar with. I think it's very hard to find a modern day analog to what was happening here. To me, the closest example, and correct me if you think I'm off base here, Josh, I think it's would be something like voluntary military service. In other words, I agree to go into the military for a set period of time. And in that period of time, the military, essentially, the branch of the service that I'm in effect, owns me. I am obligated to do what is asked of me as part of that contract relationship. And then after a period of time, I can be released, or I can decide to re-enlist, and I could even re-enlist for the duration of my career. And so that's what I see going on in this passage with non-Israelites, is that.
But as somebody who was in the military, I can tell you that's more like a wage labor thing. I mean, it feels like slavery. Don't get me wrong. Military, it feels like slavery. Not going to front. But I think it's a little disingenuous to compare the military to actual slavery that we're referring to.
But this is my point, Steve.
Isn't it?
But this is my point. You are presupposing that this is slavery. And what I'm arguing is, when you look at how Amos, how Isaiah condemn Israel, Judah, neighboring nations for engaging in human trafficking, and they're using the law as a standard, that suggests to me that what's going on here is something very different than slavery, that these are different types of economic or social systems that are intended to accomplish specific purposes, whether it's welfare, whether it's to provide employment, or in some instances, it's how do you handle prisoners of war, right? And so to me, the analog isn't, I think I'm arguing that it's not slavery. It's more analogous to somebody willingly or voluntarily going into a career in the military, that they've made a lifelong commitment to go into the military as a way to support, as a way for them to support themselves. Sorry.
I want to respect all of our friends that showed up live so that they could throw their questions at us. We're only gonna have time for a couple more. Try to keep it. No. Just let's see how many we can get through. Let's make this a game, guys. Cheshire, I think, Josh, I think this is a good question for you. Cheshire asks, is the slave just viewed as property? Perhaps so it's an amount equal to the property, like a fence or something.
Yeah, so I'll go wide to the ancient Near East, because and then we'll come into the Hebrew Bible. So I think people have this idea that if your property, what I hear is you're a beat up old couch, right? And actually, Steve, I think when you made the comparison to like a pet, that's actually not too bad. So slaves,
high praise. I'll take that.
No, I mean, but take it out of the Hebrew Bible setting. In the ancient Near East, you couldn't just do whatever you wanted to your slave, right? For example, Raymond Westbrook talks about, and I think it's the laws of Eshnunah. It says that if your slave does X, if you take him before the judges and he's found guilty of that, then you can, do something to his ear, which is probably to mark him as a chattel slave.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that the driving the nail, the awl through the ear thing?
Right. That's what you see in Exodus 21.
Yeah.
But the point is, while it seems, and you see this in like the Middle Assyrian laws, you see things like this in the Middle Assyrian palace decrees, there are things that you do to a slave that sound really bad to us. But the point is that they have rights. So chattel slaves have maybe fewer rights. Debt slaves in general are to be treated a little more gently, primarily because the master owns the labor, owns the right to the labor. Now, this is in the law, and I want to be clear about this. This is in the law, not in practice. So you see in the Bible, in Jeremiah 34, Nehemiah chapter 5, debt slaves can't leave, period. Deuteronomy 23, 15 to 16 does not apply to Hebrew slaves. We can talk about that if you want, but practically speaking, they can't go. This is the whole point of Jeremiah 34. They released the slaves during the siege, and then as soon as and it was way longer than the 6 years. And the prophets were like, "What are you doing? You got to let them go." So they let them go, and then they went out and took them all back in. Right. So slaves, practically speaking, there's just not this freedom to go. So I see similarities, Dr. Rana, in the military. I get what you're saying. It's sort of like a Venn diagram. There are some similarities, but there are also some big distinctions.
Yeah. As somebody in the military, I would definitely agree with that. I mean, you do give us some rights. I mean, there's no question about it. You have agreed to say, look, I'm going to be treated as the United States property per se. And they don't mean the kind of property you can do whatever they want to, but you do give up some of your liberties more than any rights. But they give up your liberties when you join the military, and you have to conform to the Uniform Code of Military Justice. But that is not, to me, what I consider to be any kind of actual slavery. That'd be more along the lines of economic slavery or wage labor of some kind, because you have a contractual agreement.
That's my point. That's what I think is being described in the
I get that's what you're trying to say. It is, and that would be analogy in that way. Let me ask you this real quick. Let me ask you two questions. One was in the live chat, and I want to get out because I know we're running out of time. But I thought it was a really good question. I don't remember who it was, so forgive me. But was there any civilizations around the time that just abolished slavery, that just said, right off the bat, it's bad?
Not that I know of.
Okay. And the other thing I kind of just noticed this. In Leviticus 25, the very last thing, because you said, read to the end, and 54 and 55, it talks about, for the Israelites belong to me as servants. They are my servants, whom I brought out of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Is he giving special dispensation to the Israelites because nobody else should be their, servant to them? He owns them.
That's correct. That's the whole point. Yeah,
that's the way I'm reading
slaves. Yeah, they're his slaves.
Yeah,
and that's the word that's used. And the word eved, just to clarify this, the word eved, it's like the word run in English, right? Run can have like 10 different meanings depending on the context. That does it. So eved, like a king, if you read through the Amarna letters, for example, they'll say one king will say to the Pharaoh, your servant, your slave writes to you. So, people have made the argument then, well, wait a minute, the king's a slave. So that means, slave doesn't mean anything. Well, you can't go that far. It's all about the context. It's all about what is in the context. And in Leviticus 25, 44 to 46, these are in contrast to the Israelites. These are full slaves. These are chattel slaves. They are kept for life. They're landed property. Their property, their achuzah. They're passed down as inheritance. Their children are passed down as inheritance, kept for life, la'olam, there in the Hebrew, forever. And then there's a strong contrast in verse 46 that says, but you cannot treat my servants, the Israelites, ruthlessly with perech, which is the word that's used to describe what happened to them, like in Exodus 1:13 in Egypt. I'll stop talking.
We have a question from Terry Rathman that, Fuz, in your studies, let me know what you found on this, and maybe Josh, you can comment. Terry Rathman says, so how did other cultures treat their slaves as compared to what God prescribed for treating slaves? And then he says, kind of tongue in cheek, any takers on which system you would want to be a slave?
Well, I mean, I think, from my perspective, I don't know, I'm not familiar with the cultures of the ancient Near East, so I can't really answer that, other than to say, as I've spent quite a bit of time recently looking through these passages, what impresses me time and time again is how much effort is being placed on, and how much emphasis, is being placed on how to protect those people that are vulnerable within this, is the society of Israel, right? How do we protect these people from being oppressed? I'm really impressed with again, the emphasis on that, the extent. It really seems that those people that are on the fringes of society, the poor, the orphans, the widows, the foreigners, even the prisoners of war are treated with dignity. And I think that is a reflection of the fact that the view is that all human beings bear God's image, and the way you treat another human being is essentially the way that you treat God himself, which is the point of Genesis 9. And so I think you see that manifested in the Ten Commandments and manifested in the covenantal code. Obviously there's a difference of opinion as to whether this is describing slavery or some other type of system, but nevertheless, I think that to me is what is really impressive, is again, the dignity that's afforded to those people on the edges of society, and the responsibility of every individual to ensure that they live their lives, if they're in a position of influence or of prominence, that their responsibility is to treat those people well.
Josh, you have any thoughts to wrap us up on there?
Protecting the poor and the oppressed, this is the ancient Near Eastern trope. This is what kings did. Everybody go pick up Martha Roth's book on the law collections in Asia Minor, I think it's what it's called, and just read the introductions to each of these law codes. I mean, this is what kings did to protect the poor, to protect the innocent, to protect the weak, to protect the slave. Daisy Yulin Tsai wrote a book on Deuteronomy and the humanitarian developments. I think there probably are some, but generally speaking, slavery in the ancient Near East, slavery in the Hebrew Bible, there's really not a lot of difference between the two.
All right. Well, we did not get to everybody's questions, but that's because there were so many great questions. Really.
What's that? Part 2 coming up one of these days?
What?
Okay.
What? Part 2? Okay.
I'm in.
Down.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Hey, we definitely have to have you back, Josh. And by the way, we should take a moment to make sure you're able to tell people about your book. Even though I don't think I would agree with the conclusions of your book, I did really appreciate the book. I thought it was fair and balanced and measured and really well thought out. And so it's a great book to see a perspective on that would differ from what a typical Christian might think about quote unquote slavery in the Old Testament. But again, I think it was what was well done and is worth being on everybody's library shelf.
I really appreciate that.
Yeah,
if they're interested
Josh,
in this question.
Yeah, what is the title of the book, and how do people get it, Josh?
Did the Old
there you
Testament
go.
endorse slavery? We published it ourselves, Digital Hammurabi Press. My wife is really the brains behind it. The point of the book is not to break any new ground. Basically, what I'm doing is saying, here's consensus scholarship. So evangelical scholarship, liberal scholarship, whatever people want to call it. This is it's heavily footnoted, is long bibliography. That's the point of it, is to try to get the average reader, the non-specialist who's interested in this sort of thing, to be able to. So where do I go? Where do I go to look at some of these things? So interestingly enough, this really isn't. I feel like I need to say this. This isn't really a debated issue. Not whether God is pro-slavery. I thought that was an interesting title to the stream. But whether the Hebrew Bible endorses slavery is not really debated in evangelical liberal just consensus scholarship. It's
Do
not
you
really
think it's an
debated.
entirely different question then?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
is God pro-slavery is a theological question.
Yes.
And it's not one that I think that people have misconceptions about what went on in the New Testament and what went on in the early church. The idea that the New Testament comes out strong against slavery is incorrect. Philemon is probably not something we can lean on too terribly much. Jesus' parables are actually very supportive in the sense of explaining and assuming slavery. So, I mean, and of course, the early church. I mean, you have slave collars that have the hero on them. You know, Jennifer Glancy is a great person to read on this, or Ronald Charles. Those two names, Jennifer Glancy, Ronald Charles. Sorry.
And by the way, I should note for the audience, because somebody had mentioned it, Dr. Bowen was a guest on the Non Sequitur show, and he was one of our more popular guests. As a matter of fact, I wish I would have prepared. I didn't even think about this. I have a relief that I got sent from you from Digital Hammurabi. I still have. I was packing some stuff. I have that, but he has a great channel now that it's all about assyriology and learning Babylonian stuff, and I mean, it's
all due to Steve, because Steve was like,
course,
"You're
yes.
gonna."
I don't know any about that stuff.
You said no. First stream, you said so. Dr. Josh, I understand that you're going to start a stream, and I went.
We did kind of talk. You know what? You got a point there. We did talk you into it, didn't we?
And you're the one that got me. We just hit 20,000 subs.
Yeah. Okay, week. So I want my 5%.
You got it.
So Josh, you said that if you were taking this on, you said that this was an interesting way of couching it. That if we were to have a follow-up conversation, because it looks like people in the chat, they're here to the end, they're hanging tight,
this and is a huge topic.
They want part 2. So you would approach it more along the lines of, you said the Old Testament, and how did you phrase that again?
I mean, I think the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, endorses slavery. And what I mean by that is it calls out, you know, it says this is a practice that you can do. And, you know, how people develop that theologically, this argument like from Matthew 19 about divorce and trying to make comparison, you know, you're not going to have a direct connection there. You can make some sort of an implication. The problem is that the early church didn't see it. The early church didn't practice it. And of course, as church history went through, it took a long time to work slavery out. But I mean, those are theological issues. And I think for me, the big point is to try to say, what is it that these passages are saying? What does the Hebrew say? You know, and what are the practices that we see in the ancient Near East that inform those translations? And
you'd be game to come back on and
absolutely.
We'll see if we can
I would like to get more into the theological implications of it. What if God does allow for slavery? I mean, if you could ask God a question saying, "Hey God, what did you think of slavery?" What would be his answer, do you think?
It would be Amos 1, 2, and 8.
See, the interesting thing about Amos is that's mass deportation of people. This is slave market stuff, right? So you can't make a correlation between Leviticus 25.
That's for part 2.
I'm just saying, we put a pin in this. We are so not done. We are so not done with this conversation. As we wrap up, I do want to remind everybody that the link to Josh's book, again, is in the description, and it will be in the uploaded version. So just take a look for that. You can click on it. You can find his book there. Fuz, let us know if people are interested in following you, how they can follow you, and Steve, you as well.
Go ahead, Fuz.
Oh, you know, I'm on Facebook and Twitter, so you know, I've got a pretty unusual name, so just search my name and you should be able to follow me and like me and all that good stuff.
Yeah, same here. I use my name. It's my real name, Facebook, Twitter, and my channel, Steve McRae, if you like talk about philosophy, science, politics, kind of a potpourri of stuff, I guess you can say. And we have Caffeine Corner every Monday with Cheshire Vic, who's in the live chat there.
And we love Cheshire.
We love Cheshire.
She's amazing. And Josh, did I hear you have a channel as well? Some way that people can follow you besides just purchasing your book?
Yeah, we're Digital Hammurabi. So digital Hammurabi. I always forget how to spell his name. We have a website, digitalhammurabi.com, but our YouTube channel is Digital Hammurabi. My wife is, we run a scholarship program where we give PhD students, it's totally crowdfunded, and we provide PhD students in the ancient Near East and Hebrew Bible $2,000 scholarships to kind of get them through through the summer periods when they don't have any funding. We've been able to give 3 $2,000 scholarships each year for the past 2 years. We just started a Black Scholars Matter which is another scholarship program. But yeah, so my wife is the brains behind all of that, Megan Lewis. But yeah, Digital Hammurabi.
That's awesome. And we'll also make sure to put that in the description so people
Thank you.
can follow you there. It is.
I'm sorry I was very cheeky. I feel like I was very cheeky tonight.
No, this
Really?
is, yeah. No,
You haven't seen our
nobody
other
can,
episodes, have you?
nobody can out cheek. Nobody
He's
can
like, what
out
show am I on?
Nobody can out cheek Steve anytime.
Yeah, really, right?
Yes. Let's come back to this. Thank you to everybody, Fuz, Steve, Josh. I appreciate you. Everybody who
This was great.
who's
Thank you.
hung tight with us, and all of our viewers and all the great questions. I'm so sorry that we didn't get to all of them, but come back. We're going to obviously be back on this topic again in the future. We look forward to seeing you again next time on Agree to Argue. Don't forget to bring your curiosity, your challenges, your humor, but most of all, play nice. And we'll see you next time.